People tell me they idolize me, want to be like me, but I tell them, trust me, you don't want my life. I've been a very tortured soul. These are the words of the legendary producer Phil Spector. As I'll get into, his portrayal of himself as a tortured soul was an understatement, and he displayed some of the most toxic, manipulative, and violent behavior the music industry has ever seen. Phil Spector grew up in the Bronx and came from a Jewish family that had emigrated from Ukraine. Things were incredibly tough for his family during his early years and eventually took its toll when his father decided to take his own life. Phil was only 9 years old when this happened, and this unquestionably had a lasting impact on his life. In the aftermath, the family swapped New York for Los Angeles. Music was an outlet for Phil growing up, and he even started singing and performing his own songs. At age 17, he started his own band known as the Teddy Bears, who had a hit song named To Know Him Is to Love Him. This song reached #1 on the Billboard charts. The song is a sugary and sweet doo-wop song, but underpinned by a secret tragedy. Spector came about the phrase "to know him is to love him" because it was etched on his father's gravestone. The Teddy Bears, by all accounts, were one-hit wonders, but this hit was Spector's foot in the door of the music industry. He was mentored by the songwriting duo Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. Spector worked on hits for other people, such as Benny King's song Spanish Harlem, and worked as a session musician on the Drifters song on Broadway. Coincidentally, Phil's introduction to a woman from Spanish Harlem would be a life-changing moment, both personally and professionally. In 1961, Spector and a promoter named Lester Sill formed a record company named Phillies, which combined both of their names together. And in 1963, a little-known girl group from Spanish Harlem called the Ronettes auditioned for him. The group consisted of Ronnie, her sister Estelle, and their cousin Nedra. After a rousing rendition of Why Do Fools Fall in Love, Spector jumped off his chair and said, "That's it, that's it, that's the voice I've been looking for." The Ronettes would have a major hit with the song Be My Baby and reach #2 on the Billboard charts. The song in particular would incorporate Spector's iconic wall of sound, which is a term for Phil's process of having multiple singers and instruments in the studio at the same time, which Spector would later refine and condense. As well as Spector's working relationship with the Ronettes, Spector would also get involved romantically with their lead singer Ronnie. And within this relationship, Spector's dark side started to emerge.
Phil's like a little Jewish guy in college, you know? Like, because when I went to G-Dub was like half Jewish school, you know? And so I knew a lot of guys like Phil. He was like a little Jewish guy in high school, or just out of high school. Very nice, but very ambitious and, you know, ready to make that dollar, which I loved. I love that kind of guy anyway. You know? He was, he had a lot of guts, and I like that.
Ronnie and Phil fell madly in love. For Ronnie, it was Phil's power that she was attracted to. According to Ronnie, "First, I fell in love with his coolness. He was very cool. Always had one hand in his pocket. The way he handled the band, he's a guy, 24 years old, yet he's telling married men with children what to do. That turned me on so much. I fell in love with that power." This power would lure Ronnie into this relationship, and at the same time, it was the same power that would prevent her from ever leaving it. The first red flag was the age gap and initial power imbalance. Spector had made his money early, and at 24, he was a successful music producer. Ronnie was only 17 and at the beginning of her career. Throughout their early days, Ronnie was under the impression that they were dating. But from Phil's perspective, this was merely an affair. Unbeknownst to Ronnie, Phil was already married to Annette Mirar, a lead vocalist of the Spectors 3. Phil wanted a relationship with Ronnie that was non-exclusive for him, but exclusive for her. The Ronettes went on tour with the Rolling Stones, and Ronnie was forbidden to speak with them, as Phil felt that she would be unfaithful. While you could argue that Spector's production and influence benefited Ronnie's career, there are specific examples where Phil did the opposite. In 1965, the Ronettes were set to go on tour with the Beatles, and Ronnie was replaced in the group by her cousin. The official line was that she wanted to stay with Phil, but as this relationship unraveled, it was clear that this was not her decision. As the relationship went on, the questionable behavior from Phil turned into unquestionably abusive and controlling behavior. Spector eventually divorced Annette in 1966 and married Ronnie in 1968. By then, Ronnie was retired from music. Spector made the walls close in on Ronnie, both figuratively and literally. Inside the Hollywood mansion, Ronnie was not allowed to leave. Guard dogs and barbed wire surrounded the perimeters. Despite being one of the biggest stars of the 60s, she was not allowed to have her own shoes. Ronnie had to ask Phil to use shoes to leave the house. Down in the basement, things got even darker. Here, Phil had placed a golden coffin with a glass cover and told Ronnie, "This is where you'll end up if you ever try to leave me." Ronnie was unable to have children, so they adopted a child named Dante in 1968. And in Christmas 1971, Phil gave her the strangest Christmas present ever. According to Ronnie, we were in the car and all of a sudden we pull up to the mansion and there's a fountain, and there are these twins running around. These blonde-haired, blue-eyed twins. I'm saying, what's this? He said, Merry Christmas. He never said, Ronnie, what do you think we should do? Should we adopt twins? Nothing. Everything was a surprise, and no woman wants live children as a surprise. Ronnie would also suffer from alcoholism. This was to deal with the traumatic life she was leading, but also going to rehab gave her an excuse to leave the house. In 1972, Ronnie's mother eventually realized that her daughter was faced with a fight-or-flight situation. She told her beloved daughter, I'm your mother and I'm telling you, we gotta get out of here, or you, my little girl, are going to be gone. It was at this moment that a barefoot Ronnie made a break for it. They asked Phil if they could go for a walk, and she wasn't allowed to bring her shoes. Phil told his mother-in-law, Now Mrs. Bennett, don't let Veronica step on anything sharp. Ronnie and her mother went for a walk and never came back. A bitter divorce would ensue where Phil would continue to flex his power and won custody of the kids, as well as all of the money from the Ronettes. Ronnie was free of Spector's clutches, but Spector's behavior would reverberate in many different ways across multiple people. And looking at these other cases, Ronnie was lucky to get out alive. Phil Spector eventually got to work with the Beatles. He produced on their final album, Let It Be, and got to work with George Harrison and John Lennon on their solo albums. With his relationship with George Harrison, we see how Phil could be charming and would choose which people he was nice to. With George, Phil was gifted with a vault of songs rejected during his Beatles days, but Spector knew they were going to be hits. So Phil sought to benefit from this relationship and, as such, was incredibly nice to him. There is a letter addressed to George with the very cordial sign-off. George, thank you for all your understanding about what we discussed. I appreciate your concern very much and hope to see you as soon as it is possible. Much love. Regards to everyone. Hare Krishna, Phil Spector. Phil was similarly well behaved when working with John Lennon at first. Klaus Voormann, who worked on John's first 2 solo albums, had very positive things to say about Spector. Phil Spector was fantastic. He was very subdued. He was cooperative. He never had a fight with Yoko or any disagreement. However, John Lennon admitted that he had to assert control and put Spector's ego in check. According to John, he's got a tremendous ego. He considers the artist like a film director considers actors, just pieces of garbage, canned goods that you bring on and wheel off. He'd like to bury the artist, and so the production is the main thing, but we didn't allow him to do that to us. Lennon added, so on that level it was very good, because we used what we considered is his amazing ear for pop music and sound, without letting it become deep voice Spector. It was not until 1973 when John Lennon was recording his covers album Rock and Roll that Spector tried to flex his power. John Lennon had stood up to him and was a wealthier and more respected figure than Spector. So there was only one way that Phil could flex his power over Lennon. Both Lennon and Spector drank heavily during the recording sessions, and Spector, for whatever reason, carried a gun with him. Spector claims that it was a prank, but he fired the gun in the control room, and the bullet was just inches from John's ear. John reportedly shouted, Phil, if you're going to kill me, but don't fuck with my ears, I need them. On other occasions, Spector pulled a gun and chased Lennon through the studio and was screaming violent threats at him. With the gun, Spector could redress the balance of power, and he would do the same tactic with others. The singer Leonard Cohen would be the next to find out firsthand just how off the rails Spector was. In 1976, Phil was working with the poet and singer Leonard Cohen for his new album Death of a Ladies' Man. Cohen was invited to Spector's mansion in the Hollywood Hills. Upon entering, Cohen noticed that the air conditioning was on full blast to a freezing degree and that Spector was horrible to his staff. Unlike when Phil first met Ronnie, there was less of a power imbalance. Leonard Cohen was a grown man who was successful in the music industry and was not afraid to call out some of Spector's behavior. And Cohen remembers telling him, rather than watch you shout at your servants, let's do something more interesting. Strangely, Spector had locked all of the exits. It was during one night that Phil pressed a gun up to Leonard's head and said, Leonard, I love you. Leonard responded, I hope you do. Cohen escaped the mansion and ended up with an album he was unsatisfied with, and pulling out a gun would soon become just something Phil Spector did for his own amusement with other musicians. In the late 1970s, Debbie Harry from Blondie was invited back to his house. Harry said, he pulled a gun, that notorious thing he does. He stuck it in my boot and went, bang. I thought, get me out of here. I just want to go home. Why would anyone be carrying a .45 automatic in their home? Spector also worked with the Ramones. One day, D.D. Ramone was exhausted from working in the studio all day and decided to call it a night. In response, Spector whipped out his gun and said, "You're not going anywhere." Spector once again had met someone willing to stand up to him. D.D. called his bluff and said, "What are you going to do? Shoot me? Go ahead. I'm leaving. Goodbye." When piecing all of these horrifying anecdotes together, it should come as no surprise as to what was going to happen. The actress Lana Clarkson would have another chilling encounter with Spector. However, she would live to tell the tale. On February 2, 2003, Spector was at the House of Blues nightclub in Los Angeles, where the actress Lana Clarkson was working as a server. Lana went back to Spector's home. Later that night, a distraught-looking Spector told his chauffeur, "I think I killed somebody." The driver called the police, and Lana Clarkson was found dead inside her home. She was found shot dead. Spector was subject to an investigation and avoided prison through a $1 million bail. Spector alleged that Clarkson shot herself, and it was suicide. Spector would stick to this story. He emailed friends that it was an accidental suicide and told Esquire magazine, "She kissed the gun. I have no idea why." In September 2003, a coroner's report disputed Spector's story, saying that it was homicide and not suicide. The investigation charged Spector with murder, to which Spector pleaded not guilty. To defend his case, Spector hired Robert Shapiro, one of the defense attorneys who represented O.J. Simpson. Spector later fired him and hired Leslie Abramson as a replacement. In May 2004, Spector was given an unexpected lifeline. Medical experts brought forth by Spector's team found that Clarkson may have shot the gun. This would provide Spector with significant reasonable doubt that could swing the jury in his favor. The most compelling evidence of Phil's innocence was that gun residue was found on Clarkson's hand. There was also no forensic evidence that Spector held the gun either. In August, Spector's defense team resigned, and Abramson was replaced by Bruce Cutler. His trial also included testimony from people who Spector had pulled out a gun in front of. Like many murder investigations, it was an incredibly long and grueling process. The trial did not even start until 2007. During these trials, it became increasingly evident that Spector was wearing hair wigs, and these would be humorous if the subject matter were not so serious. And while you would think Spector would be fully focused on maintaining his innocence, he still had an old grudge to bear. The Ronettes were being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Spector vocally campaigned against it. He said, "I do not think they made the contribution required of some to be in the Hall of Fame, nor do they have the body of work that would qualify them for induction." In response, Ronnie said, "You'd think he might have focused on his murder trial." Despite Phil's objections, the Ronettes were inducted into the Hall of Fame, where Keith Richards gave quite an interesting speech. Without mentioning Phil's name out loud, Keith said that the Ronettes were three beautiful and talented singers, and they did not need Phil Spector to succeed. Speaking about the first time he heard their music, he said, "I'm listening to the Ronettes, and then that pure voice over the top singing Be My Baby. I realized despite Jack Nitzsche's beautiful arrangements that they could sing all their way right through a wall of sound, they didn't need anything." That year, Spector's trial came to a hung jury and a mistrial was declared. 2 years later, the final verdict was read. 5 years after the death of Lana Clarkson, it was ruled that Spector was the person behind it and was sentenced to 19 years in state prison. Ronnie found it ironic that it was now Spector who was trapped in prison, and it was his own doing. Spector passed away in 2021 due to COVID complications. The quote I shared at the start came from an interview Phil Spector did with the journalist Mick Brown. To refresh your memory, Spector said, "People tell me they idolize me, want to be like me, but I tell them, trust me, you don't want my life. I've been a very tortured soul." He said this weeks before the death of Lana Clarkson. Brown went on to write a biography of Spector in 2012 and concluded, "In the end, it seemed that nothing could ease that torture. Nobody would have wanted Phil Spector's life now."
It was not a happy childhood. It wasn't. I mean, when your father blows his head open, it's not funny. And it leaves a scar on you.